Today we will be looking at bankruptcy filing trends by chapter in the state of Texas. To do this, we have about a dozen charts showing bankruptcy activity in the state going back to 1990. All of this filing data comes from the Administrative Office of the United States Courts. This first chart shows total filings by year since 1990. And during that period, there have been more than 1.5 million cases filed in the state of Texas, which it seems like a lot and is a lot, but it's only the fifth highest in the country, even though Texas is second in population. Looking year by year, we can see that in the early 90s, filings were running 40 to 50,000 per year. This jumped up to, say, 60 to 70,000 cases by the late 1990s, continued increases in the early 2000s. So in 2003, 2004, there were over 90,000 cases filed. A big increase in 2005, which is the year of bankruptcy reform, then a 70% drop off in 2006, fairly substantial increase during from 2006 to 2010 during the Great Recession. But even here you can see that filings never returned to where they were prior to bankruptcy reform, and were only back a little above where they were in, say, the early to mid 90s. And then since 2010, filings have dropped off about 40% and are now below where they were back in 1990, and probably 60% below where they were in 2003, 2004, just before bankruptcy reform. Looking at bankruptcies relative to population, Texas has actually a quite low rate. They're ninth lowest in the country. The red states have the highest bankruptcy rates, and those tend to be mostly in the southeast. And the states colored yellow have the lowest bankruptcy rate, and certainly the northeast and some scattered other states. But Texas has a much lower rate than any of the surrounding states relative to population. Looking at it year by year, during the 90s to up to 2005, Texas was about 28% below average. And you can see since, say, 2007, the gap has been much larger. And over that period, the bankruptcy rate in Texas relative to population is only about half of the national average. Now, this chart shows Chapter 7 filings by year in the state, and it follows the same basic pattern as total filings. 20 to 30,000 filings per year in the early 90s, jumping up to around 40,000, almost 40,000 per year by 2000, and then getting up to near 50,000 by 2004. Big spike in the year of bankruptcy reform, more than 80% drop off the next year. 4 years of increase, but much lower than basically filings never got back anywhere near where they were in the years prior to bankruptcy reform. And then since 2009, the filings have dropped by more than half. Chapter 7 dropped by more than one half, are about 1/3 of where they were in the years prior to bankruptcy reform, and even well below where they were back in 1990. Now, Chapter 11 filings in Texas had a huge drop-off through the 1990s, and this was typical of nearly everywhere in the country, and part of this probably was due to the increased Chapter 13 debt limits in 1994. But since about 1998, Chapter 11 filings in the state have generally been around 500-600 per year, but more during and after recessions, and particularly around the Great Recession, you had a real big jump up. Chapter 13 filings in the state have gone from around 20,000 per year in the early to mid 90s to over 30,000, by late 1990s, and then peaked in 2004 at over 40,000. A big drop off over these 2 years, more than most places saw, so dropped nearly by half. A modest increase through the recession, and then back down by about 1/3. So right now, Chapter 13 filings in the state are right about where they were, say, in 1992 to 1994, I would say. and less than half of where they were in just prior to bankruptcy reform. Looking at the percent of cases filed is Chapter 13's. Now the national average has been right around 30% for most years going back to 1990, and even before that, with some disruption before and after bankruptcy reform. In Texas, they have the Chapter 13 proportion has been higher than average each year, starting at about 35%, running up to around 45% in up to 2005, and currently more than half of the cases are Chapter 13 in the state, the highest portion ever. Not too much difference statewide. The northern district is at 60%, southern district 64%, the highest, western at only 50%, and eastern about 54%. But a lot of states show more variation district on that. This chart shows the unemployment rate by quarter in Texas, and you can see since about 2007, the Texas, which is the blue line here, has been a little below the national average all the way through, generally 1 to 2% better. You can see that Texas peaked during the recession at just a little above 8%, where the national got up to nearly 10%. But since then, generally about 1% below the national average, and is now just a little over 4%. So shows that overall the recession didn't hit Texas quite as hard as maybe other parts of the country. Now, bankruptcy filings peaked nationwide in September 2010. That was the most recent peak since reform. And since that time, the filings are down nearly half nationwide. The smallest declines have been generally throughout the Southeast, and where the declines have generally been below 40%, and a lot of these places less than 30%. The biggest declines occurred in parts of New England and in the Southwest, where declines have been in the 60 to 70% range. In Texas, overall filings are down 42% in this time, which is a little below average. And it's fairly uniform statewide. Each district is, each of the 4 districts are down between 41 and 43%. Looking quarter by quarter at the filing trends, you can see that most quarters, Texas, which is the blue columns, has had a smaller decline than the national average, but following the same general trend, but just not quite as much. A little unclear what's going on now as far as whether filings are going up or down in the state. So in the first 6 months of the year, filings were down 2.6% in Texas compared to 5.9% nationwide. The third quarter, it looks like filings were up about 1% in the state, and basically it does appear that filings have bottomed out in Texas. Overall, I would be expecting about 34,000 cases filed in the state this year, and modest increases in the coming years. I don't see any return to the 90,000 cases per year that were filed prior to bankruptcy reform, unless another recession comes along or legislation that vastly changes eligibility for bankruptcy. Well, that concludes our look at bankruptcy filings in the state of Texas. For more statistical information and other information on bankruptcy, be sure to visit the newsroom section of the ABI website at www.abi.org.